In this episode, we're going to focus on a concept that sounds almost like common sense, yet it is one of the most reliable ways to prevent container compromises from spreading: image hygiene. When teams move fast, it is easy to treat a container image as a simple delivery package and assume that if it runs, it must be acceptable. The reality is that images age, dependencies change, and attackers look for the places where old, risky components quietly keep getting reused. Good hygiene is not about perfection or paranoia, and it is not about scanning once and declaring victory. It is about building habits that repeatedly confirm an image is clean enough to trust, and then refusing to deploy images that fail that test. By the end, you should feel comfortable explaining why scanning, signing, and blocking risky dependencies work together as a single discipline rather than three separate chores. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Image hygiene starts with the simple recognition that container images are software, and software accumulates risk over time even if you never change your own code. An image typically includes a base layer with operating system components, plus layers of libraries, language runtimes, and your application. Each layer may carry vulnerabilities that were unknown when the image was built, and many vulnerabilities become widely exploited long after the first public report. That time gap is where attackers thrive, because they know organizations often keep using old images without realizing the risk profile has changed. A beginner mistake is thinking that because containers are smaller than traditional servers, they must be safer by default. Smaller can help, but if a small image still includes a vulnerable library or an outdated package, the attacker does not care that the rest is minimal, because one usable weakness is enough. Scanning is the first pillar because it gives you visibility into what is inside an image, not just what you believe is inside it. At a high level, scanning means analyzing the image contents and comparing the packages and libraries you find against known vulnerability information. This matters because you cannot defend what you cannot see, and images often include components that were pulled in automatically during build. Scanning also helps you catch mistakes like accidentally including debugging tools or unnecessary utilities that expand attack surface. Some beginners assume scanning is only for security specialists, but it is really a quality check for any team that ships software. If you treat scanning as a routine gate rather than an emergency reaction, you are less likely to deploy an image that contains an easily exploitable weakness. A useful way to understand scanning is to think of it as an inventory plus a risk assessment layered on top of that inventory. The inventory part identifies what packages and libraries exist, including versions, because version numbers often determine whether a vulnerability applies. The risk assessment part evaluates whether any of those components have known issues and how severe those issues are. Scanning matters for cloud security because container images are often deployed repeatedly across many systems, which means a single vulnerable image can multiply into a fleet-wide exposure. When that happens, an attacker does not need to compromise systems one by one. They can exploit the same weakness wherever the image runs. Scanning interrupts that multiplier effect by forcing you to see the risk before the image becomes widely deployed. It also creates a baseline for comparison, because you can tell whether a rebuilt image actually reduced risk or accidentally made it worse. It is important to build the habit of scanning at more than one moment, because the risk profile of an image changes even when the image file itself has not changed. Scanning during the build process helps catch obvious issues before the image is stored and shared, which prevents risky artifacts from entering your environment. Scanning again over time helps you discover that an image that once looked acceptable is now outdated because new vulnerabilities have been discovered. That second style of scanning matters because registries often hold a large backlog of images, and people may deploy older versions during testing or rollback. Beginners sometimes assume that older images are safe because they were used before without incident, but attackers often exploit exactly those older versions because they are forgotten and still available. Continuous attention to scan results turns your registry from a dusty warehouse into a curated library where outdated items are clearly labeled, and handled responsibly. A strong hygiene mindset also recognizes that scanning results are signals, not automatic truth, and that learning to interpret those signals is part of becoming effective. Some scan findings will be high severity but not reachable in your specific runtime configuration, while other findings will be moderate severity yet very reachable and therefore more urgent. This is where beginners can swing too far in either direction, either panicking over every finding or dismissing findings as noise. A balanced approach treats scanning as a decision support tool that helps you prioritize rebuilds, remove risky components, and tighten baselines. It also encourages you to reduce the number of findings over time by choosing minimal base images and limiting dependencies, which makes scanning more useful and less overwhelming. When you keep images lean, scan results become clearer because there are fewer irrelevant packages and fewer opportunities for hidden risk. Dependencies deserve special attention because they are the most common way risk enters images without anyone explicitly intending it. Modern applications rely on third-party libraries for convenience and speed, and those libraries can introduce vulnerabilities or even malicious behavior if a supply chain compromise occurs. In cloud environments, attackers increasingly focus on dependencies because a single compromised library can spread across many organizations and many deployments. Scanning helps by revealing which dependencies are present and whether they are known to be vulnerable. But hygiene requires more than detection after the fact. Good hygiene encourages teams to be deliberate about which dependencies they include, to avoid unnecessary packages, and to keep versions current. Beginners sometimes think dependencies are a free gift from the internet, but every dependency is a trust decision that should be treated with the same seriousness as choosing who gets access to your environment. When you block risky dependencies, you are turning that seriousness into enforceable behavior. Signing is the second pillar because scanning tells you whether an image contains known problems, but it does not prove that the image you deploy is the same image you scanned and approved. Signing addresses integrity, which is the question of whether something has been altered between the moment of approval and the moment of deployment. At a high level, signing means attaching a cryptographic proof to an image so that systems can verify it has not been modified since it was signed. This matters because container registries are distribution hubs, and a registry that holds your images becomes a high-value target. If an attacker can insert a malicious image or replace an image tag with a different artifact, they can influence what gets deployed without directly attacking runtime workloads. Signing gives you a way to detect that kind of tampering because an altered image will fail verification and can be rejected before it ever runs. The trust benefit of signing becomes clearer when you think about the image lifecycle as a chain of custody. Your build process creates an artifact, scanning evaluates it. An approval means you intend that exact artifact to be used in production. Signing ties the approval to the artifact itself, so you can later prove that the artifact pulled from the registry matches what was approved. Without signing, teams often rely on informal trust, such as assuming a tag name points to the right image, which is risky because tags can be changed and names can be reused. Beginners sometimes assume that access controls on the registry are enough, but access controls reduce risk and do not eliminate it, especially when credentials can be stolen or mistakes can happen. Signing adds a second layer that does not rely on the registry always being perfectly protected. When verification is required at deployment time, you are turning integrity into a technical rule rather than a hope. Blocking risky dependencies is the third pillar because hygiene is not just about observing problems. It is about refusing to ship them. Blocking means enforcing policy decisions that prevent images from moving forward when they exceed acceptable risk thresholds or contain disallowed components. This matters because security without enforcement often turns into security theater, where everyone sees the same scan reports, but risky images still get deployed under schedule pressure. Blocking creates a consistent line in the sand, such as refusing images with certain critical vulnerabilities or refusing images that contain known bad packages. Beginners sometimes worry that blocking will slow delivery, but what it actually does is force risk decisions to happen early, when they are cheaper and clearer. It also builds discipline, because teams learn that fixing hygiene issues is part of shipping, not an optional cleanup task for later. Over time, blocking improves quality, because teams naturally build images that pass the gate rather than constantly arguing about exceptions. For blocking to be effective and fair, it needs to be grounded in clear standards that match the environment's reality. A policy that blocks everything will be ignored or bypassed, and a policy that blocks almost nothing will not reduce risk meaningfully. A practical policy focuses on the issues most likely to lead to compromise, such as high-severity vulnerabilities in exposed components, unmaintained dependencies, or images that use untrusted base layers. It also pays attention to where the image will run, because an image used for internal development testing does not carry the same risk as an image deployed to a public-facing service. The goal is not to create complicated rules, but to create reliable rules that teams can understand and anticipate. When the policy is predictable, developers and operators can design toward compliance instead of treating security as a surprise. Predictable blocking turns hygiene into a normal part of the workflow rather than an adversarial checkpoint. One of the most powerful hygiene habits is controlling where images and dependencies come from, because the source of an artifact is a major part of its trustworthiness. If teams can pull base images from anywhere and install dependencies from any repository, the supply chain becomes wide and hard to monitor. Tightening that boundary means using approved sources, using maintained base images, and restricting unreviewed additions that expand risk. This is not about distrusting everyone. It is about reducing the number of unknowns that can enter your environment. Beginners often underestimate how quickly unknowns accumulate when convenience is prioritized, because each small shortcut adds another external trust dependency. Hygiene practices that enforce trusted sources reduce the chance of importing compromised components and simplify scanning, because you have fewer variations to analyze. When sources are controlled, it becomes easier to spot anomalies, like a sudden new dependency that does not fit the usual pattern. Image hygiene is also closely connected to the idea of promotion, which is the movement of an image from development to testing to production. Even without naming tools, the concept is straightforward. Images often pass through stages, and each stage should increase confidence rather than simply increase speed. Scanning supports promotion by providing evidence about vulnerabilities, signing supports promotion by preserving integrity across stages, and blocking ensures that evidence actually matters in the decision. A beginner-friendly way to think about it is that promotion is how you avoid treating every build as production-ready by default. Hygiene makes promotion safer by ensuring that the image that reaches production is not just the most recent, but also the most trustworthy. This reduces operational surprises, because images that pass hygiene gates are less likely to contain known exploitable weaknesses. It also reduces security surprises, because you are less likely to discover in production that an image includes a risky dependency everyone assumed was harmless. Exceptions will happen, and handling them responsibly is part of hygiene rather than a failure of hygiene. Sometimes a critical vulnerability has no immediate patch, or a dependency upgrade breaks an application in a way that cannot be fixed instantly. In those moments, the worst outcome is to silently deploy risky images without tracking the decision, because that turns temporary necessity into permanent exposure. A better approach is to treat exceptions as time-bounded risk with an owner and a plan, so that the organization knows what it accepted and why. Blocking policies can still support exceptions by requiring explicit approval and ensuring the exception is visible in audit trails. Beginners sometimes think exceptions mean the policy is pointless, but exceptions can actually strengthen policy if they are rare, deliberate, and tracked. The goal is to keep the environment honest about risk, because honesty drives action, and action reduces exposure. Monitoring and feedback are what keep hygiene effective over time, because scanning, signing, and blocking are practices that improve when you learn from outcomes. If you repeatedly see the same class of vulnerability, that is a signal that your base image choice or dependency practices need adjustment. If you find that developers struggle to comply, that is often a signal that the baseline is unrealistic or that better guidance is needed, not that hygiene should be abandoned. If an incident occurs, hygiene evidence helps you answer whether the image was scanned recently, whether it was signed, and whether any policy gates were bypassed. This creates a learning loop that improves both security and reliability, because it reveals where the real friction points are. Beginners often assume security programs become better only through new technology, but consistent habits plus honest feedback often produce bigger improvements than adding another tool. Hygiene is a discipline, and disciplines mature through iteration. To close, enforcing image hygiene is about turning trust into something you can measure, prove, and enforce, rather than something you assume because images have worked before. Scanning gives you visibility into vulnerabilities and risky components so you can make informed decisions. Signing protects integrity so approved artifacts cannot be quietly swapped. And blocking turns policy into action by preventing unacceptable images from being deployed. These practices matter in cloud security because container images spread quickly, run widely, and can amplify both good and bad decisions across an environment. When hygiene is strong, attackers have fewer easy opportunities to exploit known weaknesses or poison the image supply chain, and defenders have clearer evidence about what is running and why. The most important beginner lesson is that safe container deployments are built on repeatable trust checks, not on optimism, because optimism does not scale, but hygiene does. When scanning, signing, and blocking work together consistently, your container environment becomes more predictable, more resilient, and far harder to quietly compromise.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.